Before we begin, a quick note about how this episode was created. This episode uses AI-generated narration to bring Dr. Jackal's voice and character to life. However, the ideas, framing, and wording are my own. Dr. Alyssa R. Jones. The content has been synthesized, paraphrased, and adapted from history of psychology textbooks, scholarly work, lectures, professors, and other educational resources that have shaped my understanding of psychology, science, philosophy, and the mind. AI is used as a creative teaching tool, but the educational interpretation, organization, and teaching perspective come from me. Some wording may be condensed or adapted for clarity, accessibility, and narrative flow. This episode is designed to support learning, discussion, and historical engagement, and to invite students into the ideas, not replace the original sources. Episode 6, Beyond Wundt, Ebbinghaus, Brentano, and Külpe. Welcome back to Dr. Jackal's History and Systems of Psychology podcast, where we trace the strange, brilliant, and occasionally messy road that made psychology into a science. I'm Dr. Jackal, your lab mascot guide through the arguments, apparatuses, archives, and scientific side quests that shape the field. Today we meet the rebels and refiners. Psychology is now old enough to start arguing with its parents, and honestly, that is when a field starts getting interesting. In this episode, we are not just memorizing a timeline, we are tracking how psychologists changed what counted as evidence, what counted as science, and what counted as the mind in the first place. Last time we focused on Wilhelm Wundt and the founding of experimental psychology. Wundt gave psychology a laboratory, a journal, a method, and a scientific identity. But as soon as psychology had a foundation, other thinkers began asking, is Wundt's psychology too narrow? Can higher mental processes really not be studied experimentally? Should psychology study the contents of consciousness or the acts of the mind? Can thought occur without images? And can memory be measured without reducing it to physiology? Those questions take us to Hermann Ebbinghaus, Franz Brentano, and Oswald Külpe. Part 1. Ebbinghaus makes memory measurable. Let's begin with Hermann Ebbinghaus. Ebbinghaus became the first psychologist to investigate learning and memory experimentally. That is a major achievement, and in doing so, he showed that Wundt had been wrong. Now, Wundt believed that higher mental processes, like learning and memory, could not be studied experimentally in the same way as simpler processes such as sensation and perception. Ebbinghaus essentially said, interesting. Watch me. He changed the way association or learning could be studied. A major turning point for him came when he bought a copy of Gustav Fechner's Elements of Psychophysics. Fechner's book profoundly affected Ebbinghaus's thinking and ultimately influenced the direction of the new psychology. Ebbinghaus was excited by Fechner's mathematical approach to psychological phenomena. Fechner had shown that at least some relationships between physical stimulation and mental experience could be measured systematically. Ebbinghaus wanted to do something similar with memory. He wanted to use rigid and systematic measurement. He wanted to bring the experimental method into the study of higher mental processes, and this was probably influenced by the popularity of the British associationists, who had focused heavily on how ideas become connected in the mind. But Ebbinghaus did something different from the associationists before him. Part 2. Studying associations as they form. Before Ebbinghaus, British associationists usually studied associations that were already formed. They worked backward. They looked at existing ideas and tried to determine how those connections had developed. For example, if one idea reminded someone of another idea, the investigator might try to infer how those two ideas had become linked. But Ebbinghaus wanted more control. Instead of studying associations after they had already formed, he wanted to study the initial formation of associations. That way, he could control the conditions under which chains of ideas were created. This made the study of learning more objective. That is why Ebbinghaus's work on learning and forgetting has been described as one of the first strokes of genius in experimental psychology. His work was one of the first true ventures into a psychological problem area that was not simply part of physiology. Memory was not a muscle twitch. It was not a nerve impulse. It was not a sensory threshold. It was a genuinely psychological process. And Ebbinghaus showed that it could be studied experimentally. That broadened the scope of experimental psychology in a major way. Part 3. Ebbinghaus as his own subject. Ebbinghaus conducted his studies alone and used himself as the only subject. Again, very 19th century. But he was careful, systematic, and rigorous. His basic measure of learning came from associationist theory, especially the idea that frequency of association affects recall. Ebbinghaus believed that the difficulty of learning material could be measured by the number of repetitions needed to reproduce the material perfectly. So he measured memory by counting the number of trials or repetitions required to learn something. That sounds simple, but it was powerful. It turned memory into something measurable. Instead of saying, "This material feels hard to remember," Ebbinghaus could ask, "How many repetitions does it take to learn? How long does it take? How much is retained after a delay? How much is forgotten? How much relearning is needed?" That is psychology becoming quantitative. Part 4. Nonsense syllables. One of Ebbinghaus's most famous contributions was his invention of nonsense syllables. These revolutionized the study of learning. E.B. Titchener later said that the use of nonsense syllables marked the first significant advance in the field since Aristotle. That is a dramatic statement, but it gives you a sense of how important this method was considered. Ebbinghaus needed material that was not already loaded with meaning. He recognized a major problem with using stories, poetry, or ordinary words as memory materials. People familiar with a language already have associations attached to words. If I ask you to remember the word cat, you do not treat it as a meaningless sound. You may think of pets, claws, whiskers, your own cat, internet memes, or the specific moral superiority of felines. Those existing associations can make the material easier to learn. But if those associations are already present before the experiment begins, then the experimenter cannot control them. Ebbinghaus wanted material that was uniformly unassociated, homogeneous, and equally unfamiliar. He wanted material with almost no prior associations, so he created nonsense syllables. These were usually made of two consonants with a vowel between them, such as lefbok yat. He wrote down all possible combinations of consonants and vowels on cards, creating a supply of about 300 syllables. Then he randomly drew the stimulus materials to be learned. This gave him more control over the memory material. Part 5. Meaningful and meaningless material. After collecting and analyzing his data, Ebbinghaus realized something important. It was not necessarily that each individual syllable was completely meaningless. Some syllables might accidentally sound like real words or trigger associations. But the entire list of stimulus items could be designed to be meaningless overall. The lists were deliberately constructed to be free of prior connections or associations. Ebbinghaus then used these meaningless series of syllables to study how different experimental conditions affected human learning and retention. In one study, he compared the speed of memorizing lists of nonsense syllables with the speed of memorizing material that had more apparent meaning. He concluded that meaningless or unassociated material was about 9 times harder to learn than meaningful material. That is an important result because it shows how much meaning supports memory. Memory is not just repetition. Meaning matters. Prior knowledge matters. Associations matter. Ebbinghaus also studied how the length of material affected the number of repetitions needed for perfect reproduction. He found that longer material required more repetitions and more time to learn. In other words, the more we have to learn, the longer it takes us. Groundbreaking? Maybe it sounds obvious now, but the scientific value was in showing this carefully, quantitatively, and under controlled conditions. Part 6. Ebbinghaus's experimental contributions. The significance of Ebbinghaus's work lies in several things. First, he carefully controlled experimental conditions. Second, he analyzed his data quantitatively. Third, he showed that both total learning time and learning time per syllable increased as lists became longer. Fourth, he studied several variables that could influence learning and memory. These included overlearning, associations within lists, reviewing material, and the time elapsed between learning and recall. His research on elapsed time resulted in the famous Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. The forgetting curve shows that material is forgotten rapidly in the first few hours after learning, and then forgotten more slowly after that. This is still one of the most recognizable findings in the psychology of memory, and it is still useful for students today. If you cram once and never return to the material, forgetting will come for you. Politely, but firmly. Ebbinghaus's book, On Memory, A Contribution to Experimental Psychology, published in 1885, may be one of the most brilliant single investigations in the history of experimental psychology. His work showed technical skill, perseverance, and ingenuity. Part 7. Ebbinghaus's legacy. In 1890, Ebbinghaus, with the help of Arthur Koenig, founded a journal called the Journal of Psychology and Physiology of the Sense Organs. In 1902, he wrote a successful textbook called The Principles of Psychology, which he dedicated to Fechner. He later wrote a summary of psychology, intended for a broader audience. But Ebbinghaus did not create a formal system. He had no major school of thought. He had no disciples in the same sense that Wundt did. He did not seem especially interested in founding a movement. That makes him different from Wundt. But his influence was enormous. In some ways, Ebbinghaus can be seen as more influential than Wundt for the future of experimental psychology. His research brought objectivity, quantification, and experimentation to the study of learning, and learning became one of the central topics of 20th century psychology. Because of Ebbinghaus's vision and dedication, research on association shifted from speculation to formal scientific investigation. Many of his conclusions about learning and memory remain valid more than a century later. That is an extraordinary legacy. Part 8. Brentano's Act Psychology. Now we turn to Franz Brentano. Brentano's most famous book, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint, was published in 1874. That is the same year the second part of Wundt's Principles of Physiological Psychology was published. So right from the beginning, psychology had disagreement built into it. Brentano's book directly contradicted Wundt's views, showing that dissent was already present in the new psychology. Brentano had wide-ranging interests and is considered one of the important early psychologists. He was also an intellectual precursor to both Gestalt psychology and humanistic psychology. Sigmund Freud took one of Brentano's courses and later called him a genius and a damned clever guy. That is a very Freud compliment. Brentano shared Wundt's goal of making psychology a science, but he disagreed about how psychology should define its subject matter and method. Wundt's psychology was experimental. Brentano's psychology was empirical. That distinction matters. Part 9. Empirical, not only experimental. Brentano believed the primary method for psychology should be observation, not experimentation. He did not fully reject the experimental method, but he believed an empirical approach was broader. An empirical psychology could include data from observation, individual experience, and experimentation. Brentano opposed Wundt's idea that psychology should study the content of conscious experience. Wundt focused on the elements or contents of consciousness. Brentano argued that psychology should study mental activity. This became known as act psychology. The key idea is that psychology should study mental acts rather than mental contents. For example, instead of studying the content of what a person sees, Brentano wanted to study the mental act of seeing. Instead of focusing only on the image, sensation, or content, he focused on the activity of the mind: seeing, judging, remembering, wanting, imagining, believing. Those are mental acts. Brentano argued that we need to distinguish between experience as a structure or content and experience as an activity. For example, color may be a physical quality, but the act of seeing color is a mental activity. That is the focus of psychology, according to Brentano. Part 10. Why act psychology required a different method. Of course, an act usually involves an object. The act of seeing is meaningless unless there is something seen. The act of judging is meaningless unless there is something judged. So Brentano was not saying content does not exist. He was saying the mental act itself is what matters most for psychology. This redefined psychology's subject matter, and because it changed the subject matter, it also required a different method. Mental acts, unlike sensory contents, are not easily accessible through Wundt's method of introspection or internal perception. Wundt's trained observers could report on immediate conscious contents under controlled conditions. But Brentano believed mental acts required observation on a larger scale. This helps explain his preference for empirical rather than strictly experimental methods. Brentano still relied on systematic observation, but he proposed studying mental acts in two main ways. First, through memory. A person could recall the mental process involved in a particular mental state. Second, through imagination. A person could imagine a mental state and observe the accompanying mental processes. Wundtian psychology remained prominent, but Brentano's position gained followers, and his influence would appear later in Gestalt psychology, phenomenology, and humanistic approaches. His big contribution was shifting attention from the contents of consciousness to the activities of the mind. That was a major challenge to Wundt. Part 11. Külpe pushes past Wundt. Now we come to Oswald Külpe. Külpe led a group of students in a protest movement against Wundtian psychology. And this is especially interesting because Külpe began as one of Wundt's own students. He worked under Wundt and conducted research in Wundt's psychology laboratory. He even wrote an introductory textbook called Outline of Psychology and dedicated it to Wundt. In that textbook, Külpe defined psychology as the science of the facts of experience that depend on the experiencing person. At first, he did not discuss thought processes in a way that seriously challenged Wundt. He was still aligned with Wundt's belief that higher mental processes could not be studied experimentally. But that changed. Külpe eventually became convinced that thought processes could be studied using experimental methods. That is where he begins to challenge Wundt directly. Külpe established a psychology laboratory at Würzburg, which attracted many American students and became a major rival to Wundt's laboratory in importance. This group became associated with what is often called the Würzburg School, and their work pushed psychology beyond Wundt's narrow limits. Part 12. Systematic Experimental Introspection. One of the biggest differences between Wundt and Külpe involved introspection. Külpe developed systematic experimental introspection. This method involved giving subjects a complex task, such as establishing logical connections between concepts. After completing the task, subjects provided a retrospective report about their cognitive processes during the task. In other words, they looked back and described how they had thought, judged, or reasoned. This was a major departure from Wundt. Wundt despised retrospective reports in his laboratory. He believed psychology should study conscious experience as it occurs, not the memory of that experience after the fact. He thought Külpe's method was improper and referred to it as mock introspection, a little academic shade, 19th century style. But Külpe believed retrospection could be systematic and useful. He described the total experience by dividing it precisely into time periods. Similar tasks were repeated so introspective reports could be corrected, corroborated, and amplified. Experimenters also asked questions to direct the subject's attention to specific points. This made Külpe's approach more active and more detailed than Wundt's. Part 13. Wundt's introspection versus Külpe's introspection. Wundt did not want subjects to give detailed subjective descriptions of complex conscious experiences. His research focused more on objective, quantitative measurements. For example, reaction times, judgments about stimulus intensity, or comparisons between weights. Külpe, by contrast, wanted detailed subjective and qualitative reports about the nature of thought processes. His subjects were asked to do much more than make simple judgments. They had to describe the complex mental operations they performed during the experimental task. Külpe's experimenters also played a more active role. In Wundt's laboratory, the experimenter presented the stimulus and recorded the results. The experimenter did not intrude on the observation itself. In Külpe's laboratory, experimenters asked direct questions to elicit details about the subject's reactions. This required subjects to work harder to describe complex mental events accurately. Historians have said that Külpe was pushing the narrow limits of Wundt's introspective method, and that is exactly what he intended. Külpe wanted to expand psychology's subject matter to include higher mental processes. He also wanted to refine introspection so that it could be used to investigate thought. Part 14. Imageless thought. Wundt had attempted to reduce conscious experience to component parts, especially sensations and images. He argued that all experience is composed of sensations and images. Külpe's research challenged that. The results of his direct introspective studies of thought suggested that thought can occur without sensory or imaginal content. This finding became known as imageless thought. Imageless thought is the idea that meanings in thought do not necessarily involve specific images. In other words, you can understand something without picturing it. You can judge, intend, mean, or know something without having a clear image in your mind. This was a serious challenge to Wundt's system. If thought can occur without images or sensations, then consciousness cannot be reduced entirely to those elements. Külpe's research suggested that there was a non-sensory aspect of consciousness. That was a major expansion of psychology's subject matter. Part 15. Judgment, Determining Tendencies, and the Unconscious. Külpe's group also studied judgment. In studies where participants judged weights as lighter or heavier, subjects often could not report exactly how the judgment came into consciousness. This contradicted the idea that judgment involved holding a mental image of the first weight and comparing it with the sensory impression of the second weight. A study by Henry Watt found that subjects had little relevant information to report about their conscious process of judgment. This reinforced Külpe's argument that conscious experience cannot be reduced only to sensations and images. Watt's work also suggested something even more interesting. In word association tasks, subjects seem to establish an unconscious set or determining tendency after they understood the instructions. Once the task was understood, the determining tendency guided their responses with little conscious effort. That means predispositions outside of consciousness could influence conscious activity. This suggested that experience depends not only on conscious elements, but also on unconscious determining tendencies. And that is very important, because it points toward the idea that the unconscious mind can influence behavior. That idea will become central in other traditions, especially psychoanalysis, but here it appears inside experimental psychology itself. So Kulpe's work challenged Wundt in several ways. Higher mental processes could be studied experimentally. Thought might occur without images. Judgment might not be reducible to conscious sensory contents. Unconscious tendencies might influence behavior. That is psychology growing beyond Wundt. The big takeaway from today's episode is that psychology changed through argument, measurement, method, and cultural pressure. The names matter. Ebbinghaus matters. Brentano matters. Külpe matters. Watt matters. And Wundt still matters, even when others are pushing against him. But the pattern matters more. Each figure or school is responding to a problem left behind by the last one. Wundt founded experimental psychology, but he limited what he thought could be studied experimentally. Ebbinghaus showed that learning and memory could be studied experimentally after all. Brentano argued that psychology should study mental acts, not just conscious contents. Külpe pushed introspection into the study of higher thought processes and challenged the idea that all consciousness can be reduced to sensations and images. That is the rhythm of this field. A system rises, someone finds its limits, a new method appears. The definition of psychology changes. We'll leave it there for today. Keep one paw in the archive and one eye on the evidence, because psychology's history is still doing work in the present. This is Dr. Jackal, signing off.